All right, so you know how sometimes like big organizations, they kind of go through these like big shakeups? Like, they restructure things or come up with totally new policies, like the whole thing.
Yeah.
So today we're really diving into how all of that impacts the people who are actually in the trenches, like the R&D teams.
Yeah. And it's funny because you would think those are the people who are like, all about logic and breakthroughs in data and all that.
Right.
But what's so fascinating is that even those people who are, like the most data-driven minds in the room, they're still human.
Of course.
They still have like all those human emotions.
Totally.
And we're actually diving into a couple of research papers today, one from the STI Policy and Management Journal, and then another one from the journal PCOMAS. And they took this really, really close look at what happened at this big Indonesian research organization.
Oh, wow.
And this organization went through some massive changes over a pretty long period of time. Like, we're talking years.
Wow. So this wasn't like a, one and done kind of
Right.
thing.
No, not at all.
This was like a whole process.
It was a whole thing. And what they found was kind of amazing.
Okay.
The researchers working there basically went through the stages of grief, like collectively as a group.
Oh, wow. Okay, hold on. Let's break that down a little bit.
Sure.
Because
Yes.
when we say grief cycle,
Yeah.
we're talking like full-on denial,
Yeah.
anger bargaining, like all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just like a mild case of the Monday.
No, like the real deal.
Wow.
And the thing is, this wasn't like a sudden thing either, right? We're talking years of pretty intense change going on.
Yeah.
So way back in 2016, they actually did this survey. And at that point, most of the researchers were kind of like, yeah, okay, we could probably use some changes. Things could be better.
So they knew something was coming.
Yeah, they had a feeling.
Right.
But then 2018 rolls around and bam,
Oh.
total overhaul of the whole system.
Oh, wow.
New leadership, different priorities, you name it.
The whole 9 yards.
Yep. And even though they knew something was up the scale and the speed of all these changes, just totally blindsided them.
So it's like they went from, maybe a little tweak here and there to, wait a minute, what just happened to our entire research world?
Exactly. And that's when that denial stage really kicks in.
Okay.
And we're not just talking about people grumbling in the break room or anything. This was like full-blown protests, petitions, even calls to get rid of the new leadership.
Wow, so they were not messing around.
Nope. They felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under them and they were not having it.
Yeah. I can only imagine how that kind of upheaval would throw a wrench in the whole research vibe.
Yeah, it definitely creates some friction.
For sure. And, I mean, that kind of intense resistance has got to lead to some serious tension, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the anger part of this whole grief cycle thing comes in. They felt like their concerns weren't being heard, that the changes were way too much, and that it was messing with that whole collaborative, innovative atmosphere that research really needs to thrive.
It's interesting, though, because you're talking about researchers, right?
Yeah.
These are people who are literally trained to analyze and adapt and problem solve. But even they hit this wall of resistance.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what happens when you have this clash between logic and that very human need for stability and control.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gets at the heart of why change management is so important, especially in these kind of environments.
Right.
Because if you let those feelings of frustration and anger just fester, it can really stifle all the creativity and productivity. It's like
Right.
you're trying to conduct a symphony, but all the instruments are out of tune.
I love that analogy because it's so true. And it makes me think, there's usually that bargaining stage in the grief cycle, right?
Yeah.
So did these researchers try to find some kind of middle ground?
Oh, they absolutely did. They started proposing different solutions, compromises, anything to try to make the changes a little less jarring.
So did it work? Were they able to kind of smooth things over a bit? So did it work? Were they able to kind of smooth things over a bit?
Unfortunately, it didn't really pan out that way.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's actually kind of heartbreaking because the research paints this picture of a lot of these brilliant minds just stuck.
Stuck.
Like they're in this state of disillusionment, They put all their energy into that denial stage, then they got angry and let it all out, and then they try to find some compromise.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it just felt like none of it really made a difference.
Man, that's rough. I can't imagine.
Yeah, and it makes you think about what that actually looks like in a place where the stakes are so high, in this high-pressure research environment.
Yeah. Are we talking about people like hiding in their labs, refusing to come out or something?
Well, it wasn't quite that traumatic,
Yeah.
but imagine instead of that like electric hum of discovery, there's this kind of like heavy feeling in the air,
Oh,
like everyone's just going through the motions.
wow.
That passion, the spark, it starts to dim because these researchers are dealing with this loss of control, you
Right.
know?
Right. They've lost that sense of ownership over their work.
Exactly. They've lost their familiar research world, and that takes a toll.
It's like the total opposite of that eureka moment.
Right.
It's more like a collective sigh of, oof, fine. Do it your way, but don't expect us to be happy about it.
You nailed it. And that's the real danger of this stage of grief, this depression phase.
Yeah.
Because when you've got these amazing minds feeling beaten down and deflated, it affects everything.
Right. It's not just about one person feeling bummed out.
Yeah. Exactly. It impacts the whole research ecosystem.
And that makes sense because when you think about it, R&D thrives on risk-taking collaboration,
Yeah.
that constant drive to innovate and find new solutions.
Precisely. And when everyone feels stuck in this rut of disillusionment and lack of control, it's like slamming the brakes on all of that.
Right. Like, why would you stick your neck out and propose a bold new idea if you feel like you're just a cog in a machine?
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense.
Wow. So it's almost like those feelings of grief can spread from person to person.
It's true, and it's something that leaders really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Because just because things have calmed down on the surface doesn't mean everyone's magically jumped over to that acceptance stage and everything is fine.
Right. So what happens if those feelings are just left unaddressed?
Well, the research we're looking at focuses on those first 4 stages of grief.
Okay.
But it definitely hints at the fact that people need time and support to really process what they're going through.
Which makes sense because even in our personal lives, healing from grief isn't exactly a straight line.
Right.
You can't just check some boxes and expect everything to be hunky-dory.
No way.
There are setbacks, triggers, all sorts of things that can pop up along the way.
Yeah, and it's the same with these organizational changes, especially in a field like R&D where people are so intellectually and emotionally invested.
So if we zoom out a little bit, this research really highlights how important it is to handle change with a lot more empathy and nuance than we might typically think about. Right.
Absolutely. You can't just rip off the Band-Aid and expect everyone to fall in line.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. People need different things to navigate these transitions successfully.
It's like you can't just plop a bunch of scientists into a new lab with a brand new set of rules and expect them to crank out amazing discoveries, right?
Not at all. And that's where I think we need to dig a little deeper than those traditional stages of grief.
Okay.
Because what does acceptance actually mean in the context of R&D?
It's a different beast.
It's not just about passively accepting this new reality.
You're talking about finding a way to actually thrive in this new environment.
Exactly. And I think that leads us perfectly into looking at some potential solutions and strategies that leaders can use to support their R&D teams through these transitions.
Because let's be real, in today's world, knowing how to navigate these constant shifts is mission critical.
I completely agree.
It's not just about organizational success either. It's about the well-being of the people who are actually doing the work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And there are proven strategies out there that can make a real difference.
Okay, so it's not about avoiding change altogether.
No, because let's be honest, that's never going to happen.
Right.
It's about learning how to ride those waves of change without getting completely wiped out in the process.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how to do that. So we spent all this time talking about how tough it can be for researchers to go through these big organizational changes.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But it sounds like just hoping those feelings will magically disappear isn't exactly a winning strategy.
Not really, no.
So what can leaders actually do to help their teams navigate all of this and maybe even come out stronger on the other side?
Well, the good news is there are some really effective strategies out there.
Okay, good. Because I was starting to get a little worried there for a minute.
But they all kind of come back to this one key ingredient, communication.
Okay, so just talk about it more. Got it.
Well, not exactly. It's not just about sending out more emails. It's about being strategic about it.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, for starters, it needs to be empathetic. Leaders really need to acknowledge the human toll these changes can take.
So no more vague announcements about exciting new opportunities that really mean half the research projects are getting cut.
Right, exactly. It's about being upfront and honest with people about what's happening and why.
Transparency is key.
100%, because researchers are naturally curious. They want to understand the bigger picture.
That makes sense.
So when they're kept in the dark, it just breeds suspicion and anxiety.
It's like trying to do a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, these are people who are hardwired to think critically, to analyze, to dig for answers.
Right. They practically invented digging for answers.
Exactly. So when those answers aren't there or they're hidden, it can really backfire.
And that can undermine even the best intentions, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's not enough to just tell people what's changing. You have to also acknowledge the emotional impact of those changes.
So it's less about, okay, new strategic direction, let's go, and more like, hey, we get it, this is big adjustment, and it's okay to feel some kind of way about it. Here's how we're going to support you through this.
Now you're getting it,
I
and
know.
support can look different ways, you know?
Okay, like what?
Well, it could be something like setting up clear channels for feedback so people can share their thoughts and suggestions.
That's huge because it makes people feel heard.
Exactly. Or it could be about offering training opportunities to help people adapt to new processes or technologies, or even just creating spaces for open dialogue.
So people feel comfortable speaking up and asking questions without fear of judgment.
Exactly, because when you're going through a big transition like this, it's easy to feel like you're all alone.
So it's about creating that sense of community and shared purpose.
And that's something leaders can really foster, you know?
Okay, so support, empathy, transparency. But there's one more thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up.
Sure, what's that?
What about the fact that sometimes even leaders don't have all the answers right away?
Oh, that's a great point, and honestly, that's okay.
It is.
Yeah, it's important to be upfront about that, to say, hey, we don't have every single detail figured out yet, but we're committed to figuring it out together.
So it's not about pretending to have all the answers. It's about being open to the process.
Exactly. And that can actually be really empowering for teams because it creates this culture of learning and adaptation.
Where it's okay to not have all the answers right away.
Right, because that's how real innovation happens, by embracing the unknown and being willing to experiment and learn as you go.
I love that. So
Yeah.
if we had to distill everything we talked about today down to one key takeaway, what would it be?
Well, I think this change doesn't have to be this scary negative thing. You know, it doesn't have to be us versus them or progress versus people.
Right, it's not one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. By leading with empathy and transparency and by creating a culture of continuous learning and adaptation, organizations can go through even the biggest changes in a way that actually benefits everyone involved.
And that is a goal worth striving for. So as you go out there and face your own waves of change, remember you're not alone. And with the right approach, you can come out the other side even stronger and more resilient than before.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.